Michael Norton, and welcome to another Champion Briefs topic analysis. The subject of this topic analysis will be the NFL Nationals topic, being the benefits of American drone strikes against foreign targets outweigh the harms, a topic that I'm pretty excited to see debated, and I'm sure most of you are pretty excited to research. So first of all, I want to congratulate you on qualifying to NFL Nationals. NFL Nationals was always an awesome experience for me. It's a very impressive feat to qualify, more impressive for some than others. There were only 10 teams at my NFL qualifier my senior year. But regardless, be excited because NFL Nationals is a truly awesome experience, especially for those of you who are graduating seniors. So that said, let's jump right into the argumentation. So first off, some general stuff. So unlike the NCFL and TOC topic, the NFL topic right here is conducive to very, very straightforward debate. What I mean by this is that the NCFL and TOC topics were pretty skewed, somewhat poorly worded, and just didn't have that much evidence for one side or the other that led to the conclusion stated. I think there was a lot of complaining on the TOC topic, despite relative success by teams on the negative at the end of the day. But what you'll notice about this topic is that it's got a relatively clear wording and plenty of ground on each side, albeit less ground on the affirmative. But I think teams probably should do less complaining about this topic and more research, because this topic is very conducive to teams doing a lot of research and then simply getting to the tournament and dominating. That said, you can't use research as a substitute for strategic debating, and I wouldn't advise you just cutting cards and not doing any practice rounds. That said, also unlike the NCFL topic, and to a certain extent the TOC topic, there will probably be a lot of very heavy carded rounds. Now, that's not to say that there weren't heavily carded rounds at the TOC. I'm just saying that the wording of the topic makes it so that the burden on each side is simply to outweigh, and whenever that happens, see the September 2011 topic, teams just tend to throw cards at one another. My advice is to shy away from that. A good summary and final focus will hit the weighing and extension and not focus on evidence indites or pulling out more cards. This is NFL Nationals. This isn't the Tournament of Champions. And you're probably not even going to win rounds at the Tournament of Champions just by throwing cards at someone. I genuinely advise against that. So some things to know about the tournament. NFL Nationals is a lot like NCFL in that you always have paneled rounds with a wide array of judging paradigms. There's a lot of experienced coaches, coaches you may know, coaches with similar paradigms to yours, and coaches that have paradigms that are nothing like yours. Keep in mind that this is a very diverse judging pool, but there's also a lot of parents, so keep that in mind. What this means is that the thing to remember is the teams that do best results-wise at NFL Nationals are the teams that can adapt within a panel to a variety of paradigms. Look to teams like last year's winner in Harker CS. Look to teams like Durham KZ a few years ago. These are teams that can win the argumentation without sacrificing anything in the way of perception for the parent judges. So that means being charming while winning the argument. A lot of you struggle with that. Just remember, it's a balance. This implies for a lot of teams focusing a little bit more on perception and a little bit less on going fast. I'm sorry, it sucks, it's your last tournament, just deal with it. That's how you win. Go for it. So, overall strategy stuff. So, there isn't much in the way of technical strategy and, higher level framework debate on this topic because, one, there isn't really a need for it. On neither side do you really have an obligation to go for framework if you want to win the round. Both sides can really compete on the substantive debate without playing tricks. But secondarily, there just isn't really space for it. The resolution doesn't leave open a lot of holes for teams to exploit in terms of confusing ground skew that you could claim or something like that. So there's no real need for you to have a minute of framework and then just try and whip it out on teams in the final focus to trick them. However, the strategy that is really relevant for both sides, and I say this literally every month, but I just never see results, is teams you've got to weigh. It's in the resolution. I guarantee you the framers of this topic were thinking teams don't weigh. Maybe we should put it in the topic wording. The reason why is because so many teams, A, don't try to weigh, or B, try and embarrassingly fail. The way to weigh on this topic is very simple. Just provide a mechanism for what is important and weigh into it while comparatively juxtaposing your arguments to theirs and saying why they're more important with a warrant. This means not using dumb warrants like X is a prerequisite to Y because you can't have Y without X. That is not weighing, that is just asserting things. But on this topic in particular, the predictability leaves a lot of space for like additional weighing that can be done in the rebuttal. Like at the end of any set of responses, you could say, however, even if you believe this argument to be true, even if all my responses are incorrect, you're still voting for us because, and then just doing that sort of direct juxtaposition. Going beyond just establishing a weighing mechanism and linking into it in the summary is going to be so important, and it's going to provide you a lot clearer of a ballot for the judges, especially the judges that are more susceptible to like charming. So let's talk about some affirmative specific strategy. So as I kind of mentioned, the affirmative doesn't have a large breadth of argumentation, but it's a very focused set of arguments that are based on a lot of empirical data. So you need to be aware of you need to be very aware of your strategy when you're on the affirmative, because you can't necessarily just blow by someone with a wide array of arguments and then just pull one out in the final focus. So on the affirmative, your weighing is likely going to be centered around the decline in terror and the benefits to the military, etc., general national security type impacts. Maybe you could branch out, but I think that that's definitely the strongest source of argumentation. So in other words, your weighing is going to focus primarily on the need to continually fight terror and the ideals behind that and why that's so important. Things like because terrorism still poses a threat to the United States, that's maybe something you should establish. So what this means is that you and your partner should probably sit down ahead of the tournament and think to yourselves about why fighting terror abroad outweighs harms that the negative will likely bring up. Things like international relations, things like soft power, things like maybe military oversight, things like sovereignty. Consider these sorts of harms, and the sorts of harms like civilian casualties that every negative team will bring up. It's much easier for you to explain the argument in round if you have those discussions ahead of time, but make sure that the reasons you give for why these arguments are so much more important are legitimately warranted. Again, you can't just state that X is a prerequisite to Y, or that X is very important to American ideals. Like, that's not an argument. Like, you have to fully warrant and explain to me why X is more important than Y, especially in this context. The best way to do that, I think, for arguing why continually fighting terror is important is simply by establishing that terrorism is still a continuing threat and a symbolic threat to the United States and its soft power that's so significant that we just can't let it fly, and that things like the Haqqani network and I almost said the Al-Qaeda, that's embarrassing, and Al-Qaeda are continuing to serve as threats to the United States and should really be dealt with. So on the negative, the same somewhat goes for the negative in that you really need to center your weighing on a specific ideal, although ideally you'll shift the focus from national security. But probably with Champion Brief's help, you'll be able to win that as well. In my opinion, the strategy is much easier here, though, because the affirmative has less breadth of argumentation, meaning that it's easier for you to preempt their weighing with your own mechanism and with your own juxtaposition. In other words, the affirmative is mostly going to be going for national security type harms. If you have stuff in case, if you have stuff in rebuttal that can directly serve as an overview and explain why this isn't necessarily that pertinent at the time, you're going to win a lot more rounds. Some effective focuses for your weighing on the negative that you can use to juxtapose can be the United States' soft power or the impact of drone strikes on terrorist recruitment. Root cause arguments like that are pretty sweet. Or even going into like military strategy and why it's just ineffective beyond that. So that said, here are some arguments that can make those strategies a lot more effective. On the affirmative, talk about targeted killing. That one's a definite argument I want to go for. When the United States identifies or suspects a leader of being in a certain place, it's very important to kill them right off the bat. There's a lot of evidence about how killing leaders is incredibly important because A, it causes chaos within an organization, B, leaders aren't easily replaced, and C, when they are replaced, often it's a less charismatic leader who's less able to recruit, or B, it's a leader that doesn't necessarily have the same trust of the people within the organization. So there's lots of stuff about how killing terrorist leaders and targeted killing through drone strikes is very effective, mainly because drones are more effective at it than prior methods like sniping and like tactical missions, which is largely why a lot of evidence indicates that over 95% of the United States' targeted killing goes through drones. It's just much more efficient, faster, and safer for the United States to engage in it that way, and you have to argue that that is the only way that we can engage in targeted killing that's meaningful in a lot of parts of the world. That was a mouthful. So, second argument that you could go for is deterrence. Now, I'm not a big fan of this argument, but I think it can serve as a good preemptive turn on a lot of arguments about recruitment. So, the argument here is that a lot of the people that see drone strikes and are affected by drone strikes aren't like super pissed off, like terrorist type people. Like, I think the assumption that a lot of people are going to make is that everyone's just waiting to be a terrorist in the Middle East. Try not to be too xenophobic in your argumentation, is what I'm saying. Like, remember that these are like often average people, people that are trying to scrape by, people that are farming that simply happen to live in an area that might have some degree of like Taliban control or something to that extent. And when they see drone strikes, they don't think, oh my god, anti-Americanism is running through me. They think, oh my god, that plane just bombed something, I'm terrified. So the argument you make here is that it decreases anti-American sentiment, or not necessarily decreases anti-American sentiment, but more that the large majority of people are afraid of drones, see the effect of drones, and back down, as opposed to getting enraged. And that would decline or decrease the recruitment of terrorists in certain areas. My favorite argument on the affirmative is kind of a branch out argument. I always kind of leaned on those sorts of arguments. This is one that I think that's very persuasive on this topic. It's about solving military overstretch. So for those of you who don't know, there's a lot of evidence indicating that the United States military is extremely overstretched. We have too many people in too many places, and we're just having to keep people on so many multiple tours of duty that we're seeing huge rates of PTSD, that the military is not as effective in the missions where it needs to be, and that it's just dramatically undermining the United States' hard power. So the argument here is that with drones, you don't need as many people on the ground, you can withdraw from conflicts faster, and that it's just much easier for the United States to move other forces to other areas and to centralize. So this is important because of that military overstretch, which means that you can minimize it when you don't actually have to throw all your people at any targeted killing instance, and that you can back down so much faster and just patrol the area with drones. So you can basically decrease the obligations of military personnel and decrease military overstretch when drones can serve as a proxy. And I think that that argument can be made very persuasive by looking at the number of people that have suffered from PTSD, have suffered from military injuries, that are being trotted back out there, and not only are personally harmed by this, but also the military is harmed by having people with PTSD serving on the front lines, or people with no right hand firing guns. Kind of confusing. So the negative, kind of the link argument that almost everyone's going to have to go for is the civilian casualties argument, the argument about how drones have a lot of collateral damage and about how a lot of civilians are caught in the crossfire. There's going to be a lot of substantive debate on this. I can tell you now, Champion Briefs will have a lot of evidence regarding the civilian casualties for both sides. The thing that you need to do in the negative is you need to win this argument to link into a lot of other arguments. You need to demonstrate that civilians are being killed in order to actually link back into the harms to soft power, the recruitment arguments, prolonging the efforts arguments. Or you could be sneaky, and this is what I would advise you to do, is argue that even if we're not killing civilians, the perception that we're killing civilians is enough to link into the harms that I talk about in the next couple arguments. Because it doesn't actually matter if the United States is killing people. It matters that the United States appears to be violating sovereignty and appears to be firing bombs at random civilians, which is angering people and making the United States' military efforts more effective. You don't have to necessarily win that casualties are actually happening. Probably a good idea to do so, but if you can persuasively argue that as long as people think that casualties are happening, you can easily win that argument. So beyond the link arguments, a good argument that I think could help you to gain some ground on the national security debate is the recruitment argument about how, and this is kind of just the converse of the argument about deterrence, is that like anti-Americanism is running high in a lot of areas, and the local populace is pretty angered by the United States' presence, pretty angered by the casualties all around them, which is only going to push them into insurgency groups who already have very high recruitment rates, and that a lot of these insurgency groups are able to manipulate people. Even average people that are just farmers can be tricked into believing that the United States is some behemoth that's just out for their destruction. Like, these terrorist pamphlets are online, you can read some of them, and they're pretty graphic regarding what the United States does, which is why anti-Americanism is so strong in those areas. There's just so much propaganda. It's a lot like North Korea even, where so much of it's just factually false regarding how bad the United States is, although even the factually true stuff is pretty depressing. So beyond that, I think that you need to make a persuasive case as to why even average people could be convinced into joining terrorist efforts when they see these sorts of drone strikes, because they're just that persuasive, and the anti-American vibe that kind of just exists when the United States blows stuff up without their consent is pretty negative. The next argument is soft power, and this argument I think is a very strong focus for a negative case. The argument here is that the United States, by violating state sovereignty, acting unilaterally, and defying its allies, is really not making any headway in terms of like diplomacy, in terms of like garnering leaks and getting military aid when they truly need it, because their allies and people that they need to cooperate with down the line are angered by the United States engaging in this sort of action because of its impact on civilians, because of it violating the consent of the state. So I think the argument here has to be that the United States can't be as effective in other military actions and even directly in actions in places like Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia, places that have drone strikes, when it angers the populace and angers the people around it that it needs to be cooperating with on a governmental level. The final argument here is kind of just like a little interesting argument that I think could be thrown into a negative case. It's not necessarily a central argument that will play into a weighing mechanism strong. I just kind of think it's an interesting argument that could be used to a tactical success if you play with it. So the argument here is that drone strikes provide a perverse incentive to prolong the war on terror, and that by providing the United States with a carefree way of killing, it's much easier to present the case for drones to the public, to Congress, and it makes it a lot easier for these people to stomach it than soldiers dying on the ground. The impact is that the United States military can just keep trotting drones out to places like Yemen, places like Pakistan, places like Somalia, and the United States public is essentially unaware of the impacts because it just keeps passing in Congress, because no soldiers are dying, and because it's such a unilaterally supported, or not unilaterally, you get my point, because it's such a supported measure to keep trotting these drones out there, meaning that the military is essentially able to continue fighting drones regardless of the consent of the populace, because they're not really hearing about it, meaning that the war on terror just goes and goes and goes, meaning that the United States wastes resources, just keeps angering people, and really just inspires a lot of anti-American sentiment.